everything is going to hell down here in Texas.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. This is your host, Big Bad Bob. Kidding. Welcome to the Loran Hall podcast. This is your host, Rob Clark, and this is episode 194. Stay tuned. Be right there. Holy Hannah, what's up, everybody? It's been a minute. I believe last episode was somewhere around 4 or 5 months ago. I sincerely apologize. One thing I do not slack on is Quick Hits, a news and notes JFK assassination related podcast that I do with my buddy Doug, the host of the Dallas Action. Another mighty fine show. So if you're enjoying this show, make sure you're checking those two shows out, Quick Hits and the Dallas Action. That's for damn sure, people. It doesn't get any better than that. All right, so today we're going to be talking about two prime players in the assassination milieu. Loran Hall and Gerry Hemming, folks. As you know from listening to this show and Doug's show and our show, we think these guys might have been involved in some form or fashion or had knowledge prior or knowledge during or knowledge after of the assassination, which makes them highly suspect. So we're going to start out the show with a letter that was sent to Mr. Jim Garrison, Office of the District Attorney, New Orleans, Louisiana, dated June 23rd, 1967. Dear Mr. Garrison, I have followed with interest your investigation into the Kennedy assassination, and am writing you at this time to provide information which may or may not prove valuable to you, sir. First, I must make it perfectly clear that I am not suggesting that the persons herein mentioned were in any way or manner involved in the event, but they were all involved in anti-Castro Cuban activities in the Dallas area shortly before the assassination, and one of them, Loran Hall, was specifically mentioned in the Warren report. Now, this is, of course, in connection with the alleged visit to Sylvia Odio with his buddy Lawrence Howard. I have not volunteered this information to the authorities before for a number of reasons. First, there was no connection in my mind between the anti-Castro Cuban activities in Dallas in 1963 and the Kennedy assassination until after I had read the Warren report, wherein Mr. Hall was mentioned. Secondly, at the time of these events, I was on probation for a federal firearms violation and consequently was hesitant to come forward until after my probation was completed 2 years after the assassination. Thirdly, I am not positive that there is any connection between the anti-Castro movement and the assassination, and do not wish to implicate innocent persons unnecessarily. I have never been questioned by either state or federal authorities, which seems to indicate that Mr. Hall's activities in the Dallas area in September and October of 1963 were not investigated with any degree of thoroughness. Early in 1963, I became interested in the anti-Castro Cuban exile activities when an article appeared in the Dallas Morning News regarding a group of ex-Castro rebels who were engaged in the training of Cuban exiles in Florida preparing for a possible invasion of Cuba. Mentioned in this article were Mr. Wally Welch, a local Dallas businessman, and Jerry Patrick, who was supposedly training Cuban exiles in Florida. After reading the article, I called Mr. Welch and he invited me to come to his office and talk with him. I did so, and during the conversation, he told me that he, Jerry Patrick, and one Loran Hall had fought with Castro forces in the overthrow of Batista, not knowing at the time that Castro was a goddamn communist. He, Welch, was upset about Castro's betrayal of the Cuban people and was intent on making amends for having helped Castro take over in Cuba. He felt that the answer to the whole Cuban problem lay in a counter-revolutionary invasion of Cuba, with the main purpose being the overthrow of the Castro regime. He felt that I would be valuable in such a movement because of my experience in the medical field and my access to sorely needed medical supplies. Before I left his office, he promised to call me when either Patrick or Hall was back in Dallas. A short time later, Mr. Welch telephoned me at my place of employment and told me that he was abandoning his open activity in the support of Cuban exile movements because he had been threatened by the Phoebes, the federal authorities. He had been told that if he continued in such operations, his citizenship would be in jeopardy because of violations of the Neutrality Act. Still later, in March or June of '63, Welch once more called me at work. This time, he told me that Loran Hall was in Dallas and that he wanted me to meet Hall. I agreed to meet Hall outside my place of employment when I finished work for the day, and I did so. Hall introduced himself to me, and since he was driving his own car, a two-tone blue 1955 or 56 Oldsmobile, I suggested that he follow me to my home in Mesquite, where we could talk at length. Hall did not have a place to stay in Dallas, so I suggested that he just stay at my house, which he decided to do. He told me and my wife that he was in Dallas to help raise money to finance the purchase of arms and equipment for a proposed invasion of Cuba by a group of exiles who were then training in Florida, specifically in the Florida Keys, namely Big Pine Key, and No Name Key. Patrick, who was mentioned to me before by Mr. Welch, was assisting in the training of this group, and Hall had been assigned to raise the needed financial support for the invasion. Hall had in his possession at the time navigational maps of Cuban harbors and coastlines, which he said were to be used to plan demolition activities to be carried out by frogmen prior to the actual invasion. These maps were stolen from some federal office in Miami, according to Hall. He suggested to me in subsequent conversations that if I help him to raid a National Guard armory to obtain the sorely needed weapons and ammo. This I declined to do, so that he dropped the subject and never referred to it again. According to Hall, some men had given the Cubans permission to use his farm for a training site in the Dallas area, and he, Hall, wanted me to help instruct the men in first aid practices with which I was familiar. This individual who donated the land was never named specifically in our conversations. Hall also insisted that he, too, had been threatened by federal authorities if he persisted in his activities with the Cubans. He had been a member of Castro's forces like Welch and Patrick and was extremely bitter regarding the CIA betrayal of the brigade invasion of Cuba. He said that the brigade had not been given the support that it had been promised and that Kennedy, who had withheld support, was a traitor to the cause of Cuban liberty. Hall spoke fluent Spanish and was supposed to be a personal friend of the Cuban leader Manolo Rey. During the time he stayed at our home, Hall made a great show of writing Rey about activities then underway in Dallas, but he never made any attempt to mail this letter, and still had it in his possession when he left 2 or 3 weeks later. Hall stayed at our house for almost 3 weeks, going out very little during the daylight hours and for short periods at night. He never contacted Welch during this period, which seemed odd since they were supposedly personal friends and Welch knew he was in Dallas. Once, upon returning to the house, Hall said that he had contacted a wealthy Dallas oil man who was interested in the project, but he did not name this individual. Hall made several attempts to contact Larry Groves, who had written the aforementioned news article, in order to get some newspaper publicity. As far as I know, he never was able to contact Mr. Groves, at least not during the time that he stayed in my home. My wife and I began to be suspicious of Hall because he made so little effort to carry through on the things that he said he was going to do. He seemed to be more interested in watching TV and getting free meals than in securing financial backing for the Cubans. Finally, I told him that I wanted some proof of his activities or else I wanted him to leave. He offered no proof and, without the least argument, packed his few belongings and left. Where he went at the time, I do not know. Just sitting around in his tidy whities, eating television dinners. The activities in Florida, of which Mr. Hall seemed to know so much and in which he was supposedly involved, were described in an article appearing in the June 8, 1963 Saturday Evening Post. Although this article was not known to me until much later, the article was written by Harold Martin and mentions a Gerald Patrick Hemming in No Name Key. Mr. Patrick and the Gerald Patrick Hemming are one and the same individual, and he is also referred to in the book 150 Questions for a Gorilla by General Alberto Bayo. In September of 1963, Mr. Hall once more appeared at my home in Mesquite. My wife was quite surprised to see him, since we had no contact with him since he left earlier in the summer. And since he came during the day while I was at work and completely unannounced and tried to bang my wife, that I added that part. This visit occurred during the week of the 23rd to the 28th of September. That just happens to be when Oswald is supposedly in Mexico, folks. The date is firmly set in my mind because on September 15th, my wife had given birth to our fourth child, and my mother stayed in her home for the following week, returning to her home on September 21st. My wife went back to work on October 1st. That's right, you spit him out, bitch, and you get back to work. Wow. My wife went back to work on October the 1st, so that the visit had to occur sometime during the week of the 23rd to the 28th, and at the same approximate time that Hall and two other men visited Mrs. Odio, according to her testimony to the Warren Commission. At this time, Hall was accompanied by a large, burly, Latin-appearing man. Burly. At first, my wife had difficulty recognizing Hall because he was much thinner than on his previous visit earlier in the summer. He was extremely tanned and unkempt, wearing tiger suit fatigues, which were his usual attire. In addition, both Hall and the man who accompanied him wore full beards. Hall had been clean-shaven during his previous visit. When my wife told him that I was not at home, Hall said that he wanted to talk with me and would contact me. As he left, my wife noticed that his car had been painted black so recently that the finish was still shiny. She did not see any trailer, which Hall testifies that he had at the time. Hall called me at work and asked me to meet him at the Dallas motel where he was staying, which I agreed to do. I'm not sure of the name of this motel, but I think it was the Starlight Motel, and I do know its location in Dallas. However, after I had talked to Hall, my wife called. She told me of Hall's visit to the house, and she said that she was afraid that Hall might be in trouble with the authorities because his car has been painted, he was acting suspiciously, and he had grown a beard and changed his appearance as if to avoid recognition. She persuaded me to change my plan of meeting Hall at the motel because of her uneasiness about him. I called Hall at the motel and told him that I would be at home that evening and that he could come over if he wanted to see me, that I preferred not to come to the hotel. Later that evening, he came to my home, accompanied by the large, burly Latin man of that afternoon and another small, Latin-appearing man who, according to Hall, spoke no English. Both of his companions were as unkempt in appearance as Hall and were supposedly Cuban exiles who were training for the Cuban invasion. Although the smaller of the two companions was supposed to not be able to understand any English, he reacted during the subsequent conversation as if he understood a great deal of what was being said. I want to make it clear that none of these three men in any way resembled Oswald. Both Hall and the larger of his two companions was much heftier than Oswald and much darker in complexion. The small man, though his physical makeup was similar to Oswald in that he was short and thin, was so definitely Latin in appearance that he could never have passed as an American. I do not think that it could possibly have been the same man that accompanied the other two men to the Odio apartment from the description that Mrs. Odio has given. Hall did not introduce his two companions except to identify them as two Cuban exiles. I believe them to be Lawrence Howard and Celso Hernandez, I believe. He said that he had been into Cuba since his visit earlier in the summer and that the invasion plan was still underway. According to him, the CIA was harassing their activities and making it extremely difficult to get in and out of Cuba by boat. Informers had been placed in their midst so that the Coast Guard knew exactly when they were going to try to get a boat through to Cuba, and often stopped the boats, seized them, and arrested their occupants. The CIA and the federal government were also harassing the exiles who joined the movement by cutting off welfare benefits to the families of those men who were proved to be actively engaged in the training operations. Hall told of forces who were going into operating in the mountains and of having been made a commandant in the exile operations. Hall was violently opposed to the U.S. policy in Cuba and felt that Kennedy was working against Cuban freedom rather than for it. Hall also said that there was much argument among the Cuban exile leaders and that this constant bickering made operations extremely difficult. He also stated that at this time that it was possible for the Cubans to assassinate the dictator of Haiti and take over that island as a base of operation nearer to Cuba. Hall told us that they had secured the financial backing of some prominent people, both Cuban and Americans, and that he was still in the process of procuring money and supplies. He planned to visit with some professors at the University of Dallas who were Cuban exiles and sympathetic to the cause. He did not mention any of these individuals by name, but as always talked in very general terms. I had at this time a small amount of ammo and a quantity of medical supplies, drugs, which I had been able to procure from various medical salesmen. Since I still did not trust Hall, I told him that I did not have anything that he needed, and I did not know where he could get anything. Upon hearing this, Hall left without argument. Hall appeared again the next morning early and asked me once more to give him any supplies that might help in the cause, and which he seemed to be fairly certain that I had in my possession. I once more told him that I did not have any of these things that he needed. He left after mentioning that he was traveling regularly between Florida and California through both New Orleans and Dallas and would contact me again. Sometime later in October, Hall once more visited my home and pleaded with me to give him what supplies I might have. On this visit, he was accompanied by a Caucasian male who much more closely resembled Oswald than his companions of the previous visit. They stayed for only a few minutes, so positive identification of his companion would be impossible. I told them that I had severed all my relationships with the Cuban exile movement, so they left. This is the last time that I saw Loran Hall. He did not return to my home from the time he left until I moved from Dallas in May of '64. I received no further contact from him or any of the other people who were involved. And until I read the Warren report, I had no idea any of these people were in any way implicated in the assassination of the president. I do not wish to state that the man who accompanied Hall in October was Oswald, but rather he could have easily been mistaken for Oswald and could possibly be the man who was introduced to Mrs. Odio as Oswald. Hall never introduced anyone to me as Oswald and never mentioned the name in conversations that we had. His companion of October is the only one with whom I saw him who could possibly be construed as Oswald, or for that matter, even Caucasian in appearance. Hello, William Seymour. Attached you will find a list of names and individuals who were said to have been engaged in this movement along with their addresses at this time. Where these individuals are at this time, I do not know, since I have not had contact with any of them for over 3 years. Enclosed, you will also find a copy of a letter from Gerry Hemming to Mr. Wally Welch, which came into my possession during this time and which describes the activities in Florida. Whether Hall was actually engaged in these activities, I do not know. He said he was, and that's all I know. I hope that this information will help you in your attempts to arrive at the truth. My main concern is that Mrs. Odio was asked to identify the men whom she met in September from old photographs, and Hall's appearance in September was so drastically changed at the time that it will be difficult to identify him from photographs taken earlier in the summer. Only on this one occasion did I ever see Hall wearing a beard and looking so unkempt. This letter contains all the information which I have. I will be happy to clarify any questions you have regarding it, but I do not want to be harassed or badgered for further facts because I simply do not know anything else. Sincerely yours, Wiley Yates. Oh, Wiley Yates. June 12th, 1969. A letter from Harold Weisberg to Jim Garrison regarding Wiley Yates and Hall. Regarding the Yates letter to Garrison brings to mind several of the continuing problems. Who is truthful, and why do the people involved dissemble when there is no superficial reason for it? On the face of it, and seemingly voluntarily, Yates wrote Garrison a long letter, giving no specific reasons for the timing of his writing. He several times refers to his reading of the Warren Report. The context is that his reading of the Warren Report inspired the letter. Well, he waited almost 3 years, which is too long a time in itself to appear likely. Internal evidence is that his reading of Whitewash 2 is the immediate cause, and the internal content of the letter attributes to the report what is not in it and what is exclusively in Whitewash 2. So, on motive, Yates lies. Well, you don't necessarily know about that, Mr. Weisberg. I mean, give the man a break. He's not a researcher. And if this cat is reading the 26 volumes of the Warren Report, it's probably taking him a while. Not everybody just sits down and, cranks through it in 3 weeks or whatever. And you're very sure of yourself that it's because he read Whitewash 2 and not the Warren Report. Okay, but anyway, here we go. Possibly in other respects, Yates is truthful and forthright, but I am inclined to believe he is holding back at best. Hall did not stay with Yates as long as he did. Blabbermouth that Hall is, without saying much more. There are sharp contradictions between what each says. Here I compare Yates's letter with my lengthy interviews with Hall, of which I presume copies have been read. There is no doubt that Hall is a liar of the highest proportions. Some of the contradictions can be resolved against Hall because it was in his interest to lie about them. Example, the number of times that he was in New Orleans. But I also feel that some of what Yates is holding back may be significant. Save for one thing, there is nothing in his letter that does not flow from Whitewash 2. That is his reference to the taking over of Haiti as a point for attack on Cuba. And this is of current interest because of the involvement of some of the mercenaries of this group in the current Haitian adventure as forecast to me by Hemming on October 31st, 68. Also, I recall no other reference to the use of Big Pine Key. In a letter that is seemingly factual, Yates slips over a few things that would interest me. Example, his place of work and its nature. It is indicated as medical only. Hall said he was an oxygen technician and believed he had worked at Parkland. Another, the nature of his firearms act of conviction. Hall said that he was an expert marksman whose garage was loaded with various explosives, who had every conceivable weapon, etc., and was radical right in orientation. Yates contradicts Howard also. On his presence in Dallas in September of 63, as I recall, Howard's statements to me, he places a man who seems to be Howard there. Deliberately or otherwise, he goes far to confirm whitewash too, and the immediate question does he go out of his way to do it and for a purpose, or is it entirely factual? If Yates is correct, there is heavy confirmation of audio here. One thing that is surprising and pertinent is his emphasis on Hall writing to Manolo Ray. This is consistent with the statements and representations made to audio, but inconsistent with Hall's own rightist orientation. His not mailing the letter is consistent with a put on. I find it very interesting either way. At this point, I can do little with it, but I solicit thought and opinion. Does anyone have anything else pertinent? Wiley Yates. This material is as believable as what Hall says, perhaps more so, but that doesn't say enough. He persistently avoids saying where he works or in what capacity. There's another coincidence with the date. The date, I believe, not adequately accounted for by the opening. That is the time Whitewash 2 started circulating in Dallas and Texas area for the first time. I then heard from a number of people involved in the story. There is the first extensive use of the suppressed Hall Howard material here. On next to the last page, her refers to the drastic changes in Hall's appearance, making it difficult to identify the men from old photographs. I know of no other point at which the use of old photographs is mentioned, only this book. Letter to Jim dated June 23rd, 67. It could still be coincidence that it is at this time he chose to write Jim. However, I think if one were to speculate about motive, he might have been motivated by a desire to not be involved through Hall or to divert attention from himself, aside from simple cooperativeness. The date he places Hall's old car in Dallas is inconsistent with Hall's account. He has May or June, Hall later in the year. It seems unlikely that when they were so politically antipodal that Hall was a close friend of Manolo Ray. This is consistent with framing him, for the FBI indications are that Ray sent the men to Odio. In general, he has little more detail to offer than the questioning than I would think he would have had with the little or no involvement he suggests he had. Perhaps he did recall mention of the Keys, Big Pine particularly, and no name. Is it likely that with no personal involvement, he would have known or had records of 3 different addresses for Patrick, including a drop in California, plus Robert K. Brown's other identification other than his business? His memory is going back about 5 years on this, of he kept needless records that long. His account of Hall just laying around is inconsistent with that of others who were with Hall on perhaps other occasions. His mention of his own conviction on a federal firearms violation is consistent with Hall's description of him, of a gun buff, who had almost every rifle made, whose garage was loaded with explosives, who could split an apple at 500 feet. Hall also portrays him as an extremist of the radical right, consistent with their friendship, and he says he is an oxygen technician who might have worked at Parkland. There is no Wiley Yates listed in the 1963 Dallas directory, although there are several Yates with the initial W. So there you have the testimony and letter to Jim Garrison of Wiley Yates and what Harold Weisberg thinks about it. Obviously not much. This guy's got some information and it's kind of saying that he really didn't help Loran Hall out. other than letting him stay at his house for a few weeks. But as Weisberg says, Hall loved to talk, and he was a braggart. And the annotation that he didn't say anything else of substance is highly suspect for sure. All right, now let's spice things up a little bit, as only Gerald Patrick Hemming can do. And next up, we have a back and forth kind of question and answer thing going on here between several researchers, including Charles Drago and Jerry Rose, with Gerald Patrick Hemming. And this is from Cuban-exile.com and the Cuban Information Archive. Gerald Patrick Hemming. One encounter is impolite. 2 is rude. 3 encounters get your ass blown away. What would you perceive to be the purpose or function of Oswald's being on your tail? They pegged him as a Soviet agent. Who knows what's in these people's heads, what they had him doing. Here, Hemming hemmed it up in a voice suitable for Mad Magazine's Spy versus Spy. I want you to penetrate these exile groups, kid, and I'll give you an extra Snickers bar. When the general laughter subsided, Draco observed, I think the Warren Commission established that it was the Three Musketeers. 10 or 15 minutes later, after more non-linear questions and answers, Draco asked, addressing the concerns of a lot of people who were in this audience about what happened in Dealey Plaza. What were you recruited to take part in a plot to kill the president, specifically in Dallas? When and where and by whom? Prior to probably March or April of 62, it had always been Fidel. The money's available, Hemming began. The first time the conversation shifted was going to do the guy that has to be done, a euphemism for Kennedy, who was at that point in time. But the conversation was killed very quick. The first big one with someone that was persistent was with Bannister at Unintelligible's house. Frank Barthez was there, Howard K. Davis was there, and I stepped off to one side. Bannister wanted to yak on this JFK business. When it switched from hitting Castro to hitting JFK, what precipitated the change? Was that time frame coincident with any change of perceptions on anyone's part, or any event, political or otherwise? Drago asked. Mr. Bannister, like his boss, William Harvey, was a psychopath. So I took him to one side, over by the fireplace, and I was a little bit perturbed, and I knocked off one of them Dresden porcelain dolls. Actually, I was looking for a place to put his body for coming up with the subject. I asked him, are you goddamn crazy? Because Barthez was connected with Bill Pauley, and I figured this guy is some kind of agent provocateur. First, we don't like gringos around the Cubans. Did you say Bannister's boss was Harvey? Yeah, Hemming replied matter-of-factly. The Harvey we know? Yeah, they served together. When FBI had Western Hemisphere, kept OSS out, they worked together, formed a bureau. One of the bureau wanks that played both sides of the fence. How long did the relationship continue? Did it continue through 63 between Harvey and Bannister? Started in World War II. What kind of contact did Harvey have with Bannister in the spring, summer, and fall of 63? I wasn't too bright back then, Hemming replied, and I had Harvey pegged as a hood. Kept telling me he was FBI, but I said, this guy is a thug. Watch your wallet. And I figure Bannister at the same time. These are mob guys that have come in with the Batista Cubans, and they've talked about doing this, and there's money for this. Same thing with Giancana and the Fountain Blue. They're all picking up the contract to do Fidel, right? No, wrong. They are setting up so they can burn the team and gain credits down in Havana. Jerry, Dr. Jerry Rose cut in. Did you ever work for Jim Garrison? And if you did, what did you do? 4 weeks. Then I got checks from Truth or Consequences Incorporated. But he screwed me out of the 26 volumes, so I don't like him anymore. The exact meaning of that is not clear to me. Okay, what did you investigate? Rose asked. Everything he wasn't. Well, what wasn't he investigating? Rose pressed on. We're going to get you on this one. He was hired by Marcello to prove that people associated. Can you imagine? Okay, here's Garrison, right? Okay, he's district attorney. And here's this David Ferry who's been sitting right alongside Marcello in the courthouse on a hard wooden bench getting slivers in his ass. And somebody's pointing his finger to hook up Ferry. Garrison's going to hook up Ferry with the assassination and automatically hook up Marcello? No, not at all. The whole deal was to clear Marcello. I think in the time we have left, Drago said a short time later, I want to address the issue of credibility. I think a lot of people here have mixed emotions, mixed thoughts about what you're talking about. And I want to get back to something you said at the very beginning of this thing, that you've waited 30 years for this kind of inquiry to start. That allows me to draw the inference that you weren't pleased with what happened on November the 22nd, 1963, and you've wanted to step forward and do something about it. Why did you wait for someone else? Why didn't you come forward as early as November 19th, 1963 to talk about what happened in Miami? Try to put an end to this thing. And post 11/22/63, why did you keep your own counsel when you had this information? Without a moment of hesitation, Hemming replied, well, for about 8 milliseconds, I thought about where's the nearest cop? Maybe I should call J. Edgar Hoover and tip him off that his boys may be involved in something. But see, there was no traffic cop around. When the government people have been trying to recruit you to assassinate a president, you really don't go to them and turn yourself in, now do you? Had you considered over the years going to either the public via the press or which ones, the damage control boys like Posner? All right, you mentioned Posner. You described him accurately, I think, as damage control boy. And you've also said, with the ostensible research community of Kennedy assassination scholars, that there are damage control boys for the intelligence community. I've rolled over more than one. They're no longer damage control. Want to give us some initials? Well, these people, then he appeared to address the audience in general, his tone shifting to one of ironic sarcasm. Don't you people realize that undermining confidence in your government, that we face terrorists today that could shut this country down with less than 200 ragheads and a couple of Molotov cocktails, and that we've got to allow this business to continue? And by this point, Gerry Patrick Hemming, the Gerry Patrick Hemming panel had nearly concluded. A few more questions were asked, and answers, indirect or otherwise, was not plain to grasp, were provided. The Angelo described in the Sylvia Odio incident once saved Hemming's life, he said, and later played touch football on Hickory Hill with Bobby Kennedy's kids. Sylvia Odio was a double agent working for Castro, trying to get her parents out of jail. Oswald was indeed outside of her place in Dallas. So was Angelo. But I'm not rude enough to ask these people why, even today. He was not in the Marita Lorenz caravan, and he has taken a human life on more than one occasion. No details provided. And according to him, on November 22nd, 1963, he was in Miami, Florida. Nowhere near Dallas, Texas. Next up, we have my favorite from the Cuban Information Archives. That's document 0447, entitled Hemming's Confession to AJ Weberman. Now, AJ Weberman, I read a few of his interviews here before with Loran Hall, and for some reason, he just brings out the absolute fucking worst in people. And the absolute most colorful in people. So, without further ado, I bring you Hemming's Confession via AJ Weberman. Hemming told this researcher, "You got me, AJ. I'm going to have to stand up here and raise my right hand and take it off my dick and confess to this heinous crime. It's time for me to get this burden off my back. Oh, it keeps me awake at night. It's terrible. Shit, I ain't figured out half the fucking stuff. How can an outsider like you figure it out? You think people keep fucking records that burn a trail to their back door? I don't keep anything that goes against my own interests. What would I have it for? It would only endanger me. Then I gotta go out and kill some Cubans. I don't need the extra work, son. I ain't worried about these assholes. I just have to take measures to counter what the fuck they plan to do. And it's work. Costs me time and money. Shit, the Cubans are afraid of me. I came out of Cuba after running an execution squad. Trying to seek out the truth to this matters, somebody's going to pay a fucking price, and it will be difficult. The whole picture will not come out, but there will be enough clues to show that people in this country have been played like a fucking violin. It's been giving a deep throat clue here, a clue there. In the first few years, I would never have put my ass on the line. Treason is a capital offense, sir. There ain't no statute of limitations on it. There's a guy by the name of Beckwith that was convicted 31 years later. He just got life, didn't he? I'm not going to insert myself into the scenario. My family feels they have been made to pay the fucking price because I didn't keep my mouth shut, that I just didn't sit on it. My family has already agreed. Fuck it. Let it all hang out. I don't give a shit what the risks are. I watch my step right now. In your last book, you gave Sturgis all the goddamn credit. Frank was thirsting to do it. Given the opportunity, this guy would have done it in a fucking heartbeat. But this fucker couldn't wipe his ass with both hands. He's a fucking dunce. The slip dick doesn't know shit from Shinola. You should have been looking at me. I'm affronted, AJ. Frank didn't buy your first book. I had to bring it over to the house. He had a library of about 9 books on some kind of shit. None of the right books. I said, do you want to look in the index where your name appears? And he looks at mine. He says, I see you got your name in here too. I'll have to read this. He wanted me to leave the fucking book. He would have stolen it. He looked at the pictures. He looked and he looked. No comment. No comment. Same thing if it was me. I wouldn't have commented on what I was looking at either. There are people in the contract business running around today who believe AJ fucking Weberman is right. Would that surprise you? And when they're wandering around, they whip out AJ Weberman's book and they say, see how we did it? There are people out in the field that believe that shit. The Death Squad people. Evidence strongly suggests Hemming met Oswald in the Marines and brought him into his plan. Hemming told this researcher, how can you set up people to take the fall unless you're dealing with them personally? Get the clue, asshole? In 1978, I met Hemming at his private detective office in the Little Havana section of Miami. I was impressed by this 6'7" man. Hemming exuded self-confidence and was fully conversant with all facets of tradecraft. He was a criminal genius. Hemming provided me with the identity of the third tramp. He said Frank Sturgis was firing from the records building. He visited me at Bleecker Street. This researcher recontacted Hemming in 1994 and found that he was experiencing a low point in his life. Broke, he separated from his wife of 30 years and moved in with his daughter, brother-in-law, and grandchildren in North Carolina. I sent him money. Hemming realized that his real friends were people like myself, who came to his aid when no one else did. Call it checkbook journalism, but it worked. In 1978, Hemming had supplied me with important information, combined with disinformation, for nothing. This time, despite outlandish claims by Hemming, such as there was an N-word jacking his dick on the 5th floor of the depository that day, he came closer to telling the truth than ever before. Evidence suggests that in 1959, Hemming secretly put Oswald in touch with rogue CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton. In 1962, he introduced Oswald to CIA agents and contract employees who deceived Oswald into believing he was working for the agency. Hemming told this researcher, AJ, you think the universe revolves around my asshole? Marina Oswald told this researcher in 94, do you think Hemming is making these statements right now only to add some importance to himself? We're all here to make ourselves look a little better than we really are. The answer to the Kennedy assassination is with the Federal Reserve Bank. Don't underestimate that. It's wrong to blame it on Angleton and CIA. Personally, this is only one finger of the same hand. The people who supply the money are above the CIA. I had never heard the name Jerry Patrick Hemming until Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney who investigated the assassination of former President John Kennedy, told me. I never heard Lee mention that name. He never mentioned anything. He lived double life. Know what I mean? Do you think I would be giving this interview right now if I knew? I inherited this mess, but the tragedy is not only mine, but the whole nation's. Jerry Patrick Hemming, soldier of fortune, commented, Posner is a limp dick fuck. There are people in this country interested in history. They are tired of being lied to. If someone shows me they've done their homework and they can come up with the right kind of shit, I give them some more details. If they don't know what they're doing, I piss on the back of their neck and walk away. And this is exactly what Jerry Patrick Hemming has been doing or had been doing for years and years. With researchers that he didn't think were up to the task or up to par, he fed them a bunch of bullshit. Had them chasing their tails. Wondering what the hell this guy was talking about. But the researchers who did their homework, who did their due diligence, who asked intelligent questions, who knew things they probably shouldn't have known about certain things, well, that kind of impressed Gerry Hemming a little bit. And maybe he fed these folks a little bit more pertinent information, like Noel Twyman, like Weberman. So, while you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to Hemming, or Hall for that matter, they certainly were up to no good in the early 60s and may have been blinded by in their patriotic eyes of their patriotic duty to retaliate for getting snowballed by Castro and let down by Kennedy. Don't know if we'll ever know the truth, folks. But one thing's for certain. It's always going to be a massive shit show. Anyway, that's it for this one.